Welcome, everybody, to this webinar. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where in the country or world, as it were, that you are joining us today. This webinar is on JavaScript integration with Visualforce, and we are going to cover some of the ins and the outs of Visualforce itself, how you can kind of make Visualforce behave nice with JavaScript, and then show you some specific example of some of the key features of Visualforce and how they play along with some key JavaScript frameworks and libraries. We're going to show you some demonstrations of building HTML5 applications powered using Visualforce. Now, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Joshua Burke. I'm a developer evangelist here at Salesforce.com. That's just a fancy way of saying that I hope to have a happy community today and hopefully a larger community tomorrow. And you can catch me on Twitter at Josh Burke. And I am delighted to be joined today by Mr. Varun Dadla, who is a senior member of technical staff on the Visualforce team, and that's a very fancy way of saying that Varun is a senior member of technical staff on the Visualforce team. Varun, why don't you say hi to everybody?
Hey everyone. Hopefully we have a great session for you ahead. Back to you, Josh.
Thanks, Varun. And you might also notice Varun's Twitter is at Varun Dadla, and this actually makes the second webinar that I've done where the Twitter handles are very easy. You've got no excuse not to follow us because it's just our first name and our last name. We don't have any cute phrases or verbs or nouns or anything like that. Mr. Kevin Hawkins, I'm so sorry, sandwich. I'm looking right at you. I also want to point out that in these images, Varun and I are both wearing our sunglasses, and that is actually how we are presenting today. So when you have your mental image of us talking to you, just remember that we are wearing our sunglasses today. Now, it wouldn't be a Salesforce presentation if we didn't show you the safe harbor slide. Safe harbor slide basically just says that if you're going to make any purchasing decisions, please make them based on current features and not any future-looking statements that myself or Varun might make. We do not plan during the presentation itself to make any future-looking statements. Everything that we are going to show you is generally available. You can use it in your developer edition org today. But if, say, we get down to the questions and the answers and all that, and we go down the path of something that's not released, we will try to make sure that you know about that. Now, if you'd like to join us on your social media channel of choice, you can catch us on Twitter at the official Twitter account at Salesforce Devs. And if you'd like to give us a shout out during this webinar, you can use the hashtag ForceWebinar. And we've got a few people who will be monitoring that throughout the webinar and also after the webinar if you want to give us a little bit of feedback. We also have a Facebook page, a LinkedIn group, a YouTube channel, and a Google Plus circle. And speaking of that YouTube channel, this webinar is usually the first question we always get. This webinar is indeed being recorded. It will be available up on YouTube. You can find it easily either through the same URL that you got on your registration email or through developer.salesforce.com. Now, I have been informed that usually our turnaround time on that is about a week, but for technical considerations outside of our control, this webinar will take a little bit longer to get online. So give us about 2 to 3 weeks and we will have that up and running for you on developer.salesforce.com. Now, if you have any questions about the topics we are covering today, you do not have to wait until the end of the webinar. Varun and I are going to try to give about 10 to 15 minutes towards the end to answer your questions live. But while we are talking, you can go ahead and use the question panel of GoToWebinar. It's usually in the lower right corner for you. Ask your questions there. We have a couple of panelists live who are going to be helping answer those questions in real time. And if they don't get to your question, repeating the question is not going to get the answer to you any faster. They are possibly just handing questions to us, Varun and myself, to answer towards the end. And if we do run out of time and we can't get to your question, we do invite you to come over to the developer forums at developer.salesforce.com/forums, where we have community and Salesforce experts who can help you out. Now, our agenda today is pretty straightforward. We are going to first talk about Visualforce being JavaScript friendly in general. The attributes of Visualforce itself that you can use in order to get Visualforce out of your way. As a JavaScript developer, you're frequently going to be the person who is going to be just controlling everything that's going on with the page itself. And due to that, you may want Visualforce not to set like an HTML tag or a body tag or anything like that. And so we're going to show you how Visualforce will get out of your way as a JavaScript developer. Then we're going to show you how you can leverage two of the big features of Visualforce, which make it very easy to build powerful JavaScript in HTML5 applications. JavaScript Remoting, which lets us get around a key component of Visualforce known as a view state, as well as remote objects, which is a relatively new feature of Visualforce, just one generally available with this winter release. And I'm going to show you one demonstration of that, and then Varun is actually going to highlight specifically using remote objects with the framework Angular.js. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to talk about is how we can take Visualforce and we can have it just get out of our way as a JavaScript developer. How we can tell Visualforce, don't worry about this, don't worry about that. I am going to cover one portion of the page or another. But one of the key things that Visualforce can do for us, and this is not a new feature, but it's been out for, I think a couple of years now, but for HTML5 applications, it's very important to know. One of the things that we can do with Visualforce is that we can control the doc type. And with the doc type being set in the page component, the page will be set up correctly when it's sent down to the browser with that specific doc type that we're setting here. And the most common use case for this is HTML5 itself. And the reason for that is there are some features of HTML5 which may not work correctly or may not work at all if you don't set that doc type. Things like, I believe, canvas and geolocation and things like that. The browser, before it goes down that road of using an HTML5 feature, wants to know that you're intentionally using the HTML5 doc type. So in order to set that in the Apex page component itself, we simply set the doc type as an attribute. Now, another thing we can do is we can tell Visualforce that we are going to be in control of either the HTML tag or the body tag or both. And so we can set this to false. And if we set it to false, then Visualforce will not try to render or re-render those sections. And so if we set the body tag ourselves, for instance, and we want to make sure that it's being formatted in a very specific way, then we say apply body tag equals false. Visualforce will simply assume that the developer is going to be doing it for us, and the Visualforce page is not going to try and re-render that or move it around or add anything to the body tag itself. So what we're looking at here, we've got a page with the standard style sheets of false, show header of false, sidebar of false, apply HTML, apply all these things set to false in the doc type. What we have is a great clean slate for the Visualforce page in order to display the application itself. So what I want to do next is show you another key feature called HTML pass-throughs. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to take the attributes that we want to add to a specific HTML component. So with an Apex output panel, for instance, the desired result there is to either have a div tag or span tag being rendered. But the way Visualforce used to work was that you had no real control as to the attributes that were going to be put down on that component when it was going to be displayed itself. And there are frameworks out there. Angular is one example of this. There are some jQuery plugins that are examples of this, where they're actually relying on these kind of custom attributes being on elements to tell the framework what this element is supposed to be doing, what this tag is really supposed to be doing. So for instance, data-role, maybe panel means that it's actually going to be displayed as a modal window or part of a page. A header maybe having it styled differently or have a different event structure or anything like that. And if we wanted to use our good old friends, the Visualforce components like output panel, we wouldn't be able to do that without the HTML pass-through ability. And the way it works is pretty straightforward. We just add to the component that we are trying to render HTML dash, and then anything after the HTML dash is going to be rendered as we have it on output panel itself. So HTML dash data-role would be the data-role equals panel. It basically just strips that HTML dash prefix when the div tag itself is going to get rendered down on the browser. Okay, so let's see some of this stuff in action itself. I want to show you a live demo here of a JavaScript framework called reveal.js. And reveal.js is really pretty cool. What it allows us to do is it allows us to take JavaScript and apply it to divs and sections and have our page being displayed kind of like a PowerPoint presentation. Except it's a little different from PowerPoint presentation, as we're going to see in the live demo. And what I'm actually going to show you originated with a colleague of mine, Peter Chittum. So a shout out to Peter. This is basically a variant of his reveal.js demonstration that he put together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip over to my developer edition org. And I'm going to pull up my developer console. And what we have here is actually really neat the way Peter set it up. He set it up as a template. And what this does, it allows him to separate one section, which is going to have all the meta tags and the style sheets and the JavaScript and everything we kind of need to do to run the presentation itself. And then he has here, the template is going to bring in another component. And here we have the other Visualforce page, which is going to use that template. And so now we can use that outer template to basically set up Reveal as the presentation framework, but we can pull in different divs and different sections and different data in order to display different kinds of presentations. So the goal here is the ability to have a basic skeleton of how a presentation might work, but it's going to be driven based on Salesforce data itself. And you'll note that Peter's leveraging all the things that we were just talking about. He's setting his doc type because reveal.js uses CSS3 transition. So we want to make sure that those are going to get applied correctly. He's saying apply body tag because this is where Reveal is going to do all of its really hardcore work. And so we want to make sure the body tag is not going to get re-rendered or moved around on us or anything like that. And we also then have our good old friends show header and standard style sheets of false. So with this, we've really cleared the slate for our JavaScript application in general. And because we've done that, Reveal can really do its work. But then the other thing we can do is we can kick this up a notch. Because we have nothing that's going to conflict with us here, the other thing I can do, sorry, I'm going to go back to the template one. I've actually added in a completely different JavaScript framework. I've got this JavaScript framework called C3. C3 is a JavaScript charting framework based on another framework we're actually going to see later, D3. And so C3 is basically a bunch of pre-packaged charts, like bar charts and pie charts and line charts and things like that. But it's also very easy to make C3 charts highly interactive. And so we've taken Reveal and we've taken C3 and we're going to bind that back to Salesforce data. And what we have is a very powerful dynamic presentation that, let's say somebody goes on the road and they are showing up to different accounts and they're doing basically the same presentation over and over again to different accounts. So they don't have to have 15 different PowerPoint presentations. They can just have the one link here on every account and it's going to display the presentation using that data. So if I click present this account, it's going to pull this up. We see the account name. But what Reveal does really well is it makes it very easy to do these really kind of stylistic transitions here. So we get a little bit more information about Burlington. And then we can also move around to different points of data about the account. And Reveal has built into it this concept of a hierarchy. So if we wanted to see more information about our contacts, for instance, we can just hit the down key, pull up a little bit more contact information. And then if I pop over here, go back over to opportunities and drill down into opportunities, now we also see our interactive chart. So we have Reveal running, we have C3 running, it's all running within Visualforce, and we have really tight, fine-tuned control over how this Visualforce page is being rendered. And so if I scroll over this charting setup here, you can see that I actually have a nice interactive chart. And this would obviously be something that would be very difficult, if not completely impossible, to try to reproduce in software like PowerPoint. So we have this nice, styled, powerful presentation that's being driven through Salesforce data using Visualforce. And by using these tags, these components that we were seeing before, we can really have this fine-tuned control and make sure that the page is going to behave the way we expect it to. So let me close that page out and flip over to our next section. The next thing I want to talk about is something which is very inherent in Visualforce development, and it acts kind of as a segue to the next one of the next big features of doing JavaScript development on Visualforce itself. And I when I talk to a lot of audiences and groups and things like that, I frequently ask, especially Visualforce developers, if they're aware of the view state itself. And my success rate is somewhere between 20 to 70%. Like usually it's not an entire room of developers who are familiar with the view state. And that's not surprising really, because Visualforce does a lot of work to try to make sure that you don't really need to know about the view state. You can just use the component structure. You can get your applications up and running, and you'll be okay. But it's good to know that it exists, because we do find that the application of the view state can be one of the biggest contributors to performance loss on your Visualforce page. And here's why. The basic use case for a view state is to solve a simple problem with HTTP/HTTPS. And that's the fact that HTTPS is stateless. So it's kind of like that guy from Memento, right? He wakes up one morning, he doesn't remember anything from the previous morning. And so that's kind of like trying to do a post back to the server to say, hey, I need to make changes to this page and I want to re-render it. Well, it doesn't know what page you're talking about because it delivered it to you and then it forgot about it. What the view state does is it gives us a hashed block of information to keep that state between the client and the server and then back down to the client again. So every time we do a post back, it's kind of like that. It's like that Polaroid image that we're handing to that guy from Memento. It's reminding the server about the work that it did before, and it can make modifications and it can pass it back down to the client. And then with that being passed down, the client can do re-renders and can conserve the state and all that stuff. But what we see quite frequently, honestly, is that that can actually kind of lead to some situations where the page is going to run slower than you really expect it to. So if I go over here, this is a pretty standard, very simple, very straightforward Visualforce controller. But what a developer's done here is, and this is usually because maybe they've got a use case, but the use case is kind of vague, and they're not really sure how many points of data they're really going to need in order to make this Visualforce page really work. And so they kind of what a colleague of, or ex-colleague of Varun, Chris Wall, used to describe to me as backing up their dump truck to their data factory, and they just try and grab every piece of data about contacts that they possibly can. And so we see we've got all these fields. We also see there's no limit, there's no where filter. We're not trying to reduce the amount of records that are being displayed or anything like that. We're just covering all possible bases, basically. And so what happens with that is everything that we send down to the Visualforce page that's going to get bound into an Apex form component is then going to get preserved within that view state. So if I go down here to this Visualforce page, I have kind of referred to as massive view state just for demonstration purposes. And I will call out, this is kind of an egregious example, right? I'm kind of involving hyperbole here just to kind of demonstrate exactly what's going on. But we have all of these records, we have all of these fields, and what we really just need this name field, and we need the ID field. See here, I'm using the HTML pass-through so that jQuery can find these attributes down here. So we tie this back to jQuery. And then we're using action function within an Apex form component. And by using that, we can go back up to that controller, and we basically kick off a couple of methods here. But you see the methods just need these two public variables right here, contact ID and phone. We're just changing one point of data on one record, and then we're returning back down to the page for that. So let's see that in action, and you're going to see kind of what I'm talking about when it comes to the performance issues themselves. So let me go back to here and to the massive view state one and hit preview. And so, for instance, what's supposed to occur is that if I click on Liz here and hit 9, and then I tab off of Liz, that's supposed to kick off those action functions, and it's going to update the contact in the background. Now, the user may not really notice, in a flow like this, the user may not really notice just how slow this is actually going on. So let's go to the JavaScript console I have here, and what you're going to see when I change this one and then blur off, you're going to see an ID, and then there's a little pause, and you're going to see updated. When you see updated, that's when the loop itself has actually occurred. So when I pause off, the blur kicks off. Wait. Still waiting. There we go. Now we have an update. You saw that long, pregnant pause about how long that one DML operation for one point on one record actually took. And the reason for that is that even though we're only changing a small amount of these records through JavaScript, we're sending the entire record set back and forth, back and forth. So there are three basic things we could do to resolve that long pregnant pause that we were seeing, that slow performance that we were seeing in that operation. One of the first things that we can do is we can basically, obviously not, since we're only using 3 points of data, right? We don't need all these fields. So we can reduce the view state simply by reducing the number of fields down. Another thing that we can do before we get into any of the other features of Visualforce, I can actually make this transient. So transient is a keyword that says, I'm going to send this down to Visualforce. I'm going to bind it using Apex form and using Apex components, but I don't expect to ever see it again. The controller is saying, I do not expect this to return to me. Since I'm not expecting it to return to me, it doesn't have to get put into the view state because it's not part of that Polaroid image that we're sending back to that guy from Memento. So I'm going to hit transient and hit save, and then go back to this page, do a force reload here, and click off. We're going to see, actually, we can see how fast that is already, right? Bing, boom, bam. So if we are going to use Apex form, if we are going to use action function, one of the things we really need to do is to make sure that overall we're going to be reducing our view state in general. But there's even a more elegant way around this particular problem. So what I'm going to do, the first thing I'm going to do is actually go back to my developer console, and I'm going to take that transient off. So I want to make sure that there's no smoke and mirrors here, right? So we're now back to that same state that we were in before. We're pulling up the data to the dump truck to the factory, sending a bunch of data down to Visualforce. But what we're going to do is we're going to remove that view state completely from this entire loop. And the way we do that is we use another feature of Visualforce called JavaScript Remoting. And so what JavaScript Remoting does, sorry, 1 second. There we go. Don't need a little highlighted text there. What JavaScript Remoting does is it allows us to access Apex directly within JavaScript without having to use the view state. And the way we do that is we take our Apex method. It has to be a static method. We annotate it with remote action. We give it the parameters we want. And then we're going to return data back down to JavaScript. And this data will automatically be converted into JSON for us in the overall flow. And then down on Visualforce, we use the remoting manager and invoke an action through the remote action global. We have our class name and we have our method. And then we're going to pass in the parameters that our method here is expecting. And then what we do is we give it an asynchronous callback. We give it an asynchronous callback. And so when Apex is done working, it's going to call that asynchronous callback. It's going to hand off the result. So in this case, that will be that JSON version of contact. And we also get some event information. So if something goes wrong, we need to see a DML error or an API error or anything like that. We could actually interrogate the event object, and we could report that back to the user in a meaningful way. So let's see how that compares to the code that we had before. So same controller, binding to the same controller, and that's basically, if it's a controller or an extension, the Visualforce page just has to have a reference up to the Apex class in order to have it exposed down to JavaScript. So I'm using the remote action. And remember, since I'm using static, the only thing that this method is going to understand is what's in the method itself. Static is not going to have any concept of the greater controller instantiation. So it doesn't know anything about this data. It doesn't know anything about that data. But that's why we don't need the view state. We don't need the view state because it's not binding any this way. We're only sending up the data we need, and we're only getting back the data we require in order to get our flow to work. So here, we're passing them in here. So these are local instances of those variables. But the overall DML flow is exactly the same. It's exactly the same. And so then in here, we're doing basically the same jQuery flow. I'm not using the HTML pass-through because I'm actually just using a standard input tag to get this done. And then I'm binding to the blur, and I'm using the remoting manager to call up to the controller and the method. I pass it those parameters, and we're going to see that same updated flow right here. And so if we preview this here, and I go to the JavaScript console, and I go here and tab off, we can see, boom. We can see, boom. It is really, really fast. And the key thing here is that even if I did have a bunch of data bound to, if I was using a view state, so notice, if we go back to developer console, there's not even, we don't even have Apex form in here. There's no Apex form component being used whatsoever. So there's no view state being bound down to this page at all. If we were using a view state, though, with JavaScript remoting, we still ignore the view state. So even if we bound a bunch of data down to the page, that view state operation isn't going to be used. And so the flow that we're seeing, that speed that we're seeing, is going to remain the same. So one of the key advantages of JavaScript remoting is that it doesn't rely on a view state. It performs better with binding larger data sets down to one page because the speed differential is going to be the amount of data we're sending up just for that transaction and the amount of data we're getting back down for that transaction. It's not going to be reliant on the overall data being bound down to Visualforce itself. It also allows us to expose Apex method directly down to JavaScript, so it makes it very easy to integrate with libraries like jQuery and Angular and all of the other kind of frameworks that we are seeing here today. It also, and this is another thing, like, so I'm kind of on a mission to make sure Visualforce developers are aware of the view state and aware of some of the performance issues that can occur when binding a lot of data to the view state. I'm also sort of on a mission with JavaScript remoting to kind of make sure that people know that with JavaScript remoting, we do not need to use the API scope. So, JavaScript development on the platform kind of has its background in the age-old days of the Ajax toolkit. And the Ajax toolkit was a wonderful, beautiful thing that got a lot of JavaScript development up and running on the platform. And basically what it was a JavaScript wrapper for the SOAP API. And it looked very similar to this. You call a wrapped endpoint, and you gave it an asynchronous callback, and you got some functionality out of the way. But that was just basically a loop back to the API, whereas JavaScript remoting is right within the Visualforce scope itself. Does not require the API scope. And the key thing there is that JavaScript remoting is not going to consume any of your API calls for a Visualforce page. And by not consuming that API, and we shouldn't have to, right, within the Visualforce scope, we shouldn't have to use the API scope. We can keep that API scope open for our third-party implementations, our mobile applications, our ETL tools, and all the other things that must rely on the API scope itself. Okay, so now we get to what I like to say is our other kind of big guest star for the show. Varun is, of course, kind of the main guest that we have here, but remote objects is, it's hard for me actually to describe not only how excited I am to be able to describe this feature to you, but also to be able to fact that this feature is now generally available. So my little journey with remote objects started, I think it was about a year and a half ago. It was a conversation I was actually having with Adam Slegman, who's VP of Developer Marketing, and he was asking Evangelist, he's like, what would you change on the platform? Like, if you had one thing on top of your wish list that you could change about the platform, what would that be? And don't, it's not like remove all governor limits or, have full Java stack or whatever, don't do the stuff that we know is probably not going to be implemented in the relatively near future. But just, what's the one thing that if you had time and money, like it could actually get put onto the platform in the relatively near future? And for me, it was easy because I'd been talking about JavaScript remoting. So JavaScript remoting, Varun, correct me if I'm wrong, this has been around for about 2 years now. I think it's been about 7 releases, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's about right. It's been around for 2 years.
Okay, so it's been around for 2 years. We've seen pretty decent adoption, but obviously I'm still on a mission to get the adoption even higher. But after having talked about it for a while, one of the things that kind of interested me about JavaScript remoting was that we seem to be having developers forcing them to write a bunch of Apex which looked very similar over and over again. Right, so I have lots of JavaScript remoting code, which is like, go get these records, go create these records, go delete these records. Very simple, create, read, update, delete type operations. And for me, that seemed a little antithetical to sort of a lot of the ways that we do, if not the Salesforce One platform in general, at least the Force.com platform specifically. For instance, the standard controller. If we go back to Peter's demo, Peter was using the account standard controller because all he was doing was displaying data based on that ID in the query string, so he can bind to that data. He can use the account standard controller, and he doesn't have to write a line of Apex in order to get that done. Well, now with JavaScript remoting, there wasn't any kind of analog to that, and so that's the response was why don't we have something like a standard controller for JavaScript remoting, where our JavaScript developers don't have to keep writing these discrete pieces of Apex over and over and over again. And so I kicked that up to him, and then I think it was, and I'm like, I didn't expect it to go anywhere because I didn't really think anybody else on the platform was really thinking about it. And then like a week and a half later, Varun, you and Chris, you emailed me, and you guys, this was already this was already on your wish list as well. Right. So give me like a 30-second quick history. Like at that point, like what's the process on the back on your side of like getting a feature like that going off the wish list and actually going GA like it is right now?
Sure. So I think we did notice that a lot of the community is moving more and more towards using a lot of JavaScript in Visualforce, and the trend was the Visualforce page was not just being used by admins and other people who did a lot of tags and stuff, but also very seasoned JavaScript developers who use Visualforce as a container and to do a lot of JavaScript in there. And then we did see the drawback that you mentioned, that there is no way to really get back to your data unless you actually write Apex code. So what we wanted to give them was a tool that would help them avoid this and just write pure JavaScript on their pages if that is what they really wanted. And I know that we did take cues from a couple other community developed frameworks out there that allowed you to do this, but then you still had to install a couple new components into your org. So what we wanted to give them is like a very clean implementation that would just get out of your way, give you basic CRUD functionality right there, right in your page in JavaScript. And I think it took us about a release worth of work to come out with the pilot. And we were really excited with all the feedback, and I think there are some new things coming with the GA as well.
It's really, for me, it was kind of because I usually, I try to keep pace with project managers and how features are kind of coming down. It was really nice to see a feature that kind of came, so nascent to going to GA. And so we're talking about how great remote objects is. And let's describe. So now let's describe exactly what we're talking about. So you've been looking at the slide for a little while. We're talking about how great it is. Let me tell you exactly what it is that you're looking at. Remote objects is a Visualforce component. So you see here we've got the Apex remote objects, and then within that component, we can define data models. So remote object model is going to allow us to define a data model. So in this case, I'm binding it to contact. And I can also bind it to specific fields, so first name, last name, ID, and email. We can get a little JavaScript shorthand too, so that we can refer to specifically in JavaScript what that's going to do. Because what this will do is it's going to generate a client-side JavaScript library data model for you. So it's basically a data layer in JavaScript that gives you direct access to the data layer itself. So we don't need Apex in this case in order to do create, read, update, delete, and describe, as Varun's actually going to show a little bit later on as well. And so with this, we have very tight control over our data right here from JavaScript, without having to use any kind of Apex in order to get this baseline functionality done. And so it's akin to a standard controller, but it's also very important to point out that unlike a standard controller, so you have one standard controller per page, unlike a standard controller, we can actually bind multiple object models down to the same page. And so you could have contact, you could have account, you could have opportunity. And the reason why this is all being done as this kind of Visualforce component is because we are going to bind it back to whatever in the org itself. So if it's you can't, for instance, bind to a field that doesn't exist. You can't just throw stuff in there. We'll actually verify the fact that the object model is valid, and then it will create the JavaScript library for you, and then you can use that JavaScript library in order to access and manipulate your data. So let's see a couple of quick review of that. Same advantages of JavaScript remoting, no Apex required, can reference multiple data models, and we also have a feature where, kind of like an extension, you can also replace specific functions with JavaScript remoting. So let's look at one demonstration of that. This is using a library called D3, and D3 is actually the engine that basically made C3.js run. And so the way C3.js runs is by rendering all of its stuff through D3. And what D3 basically does is it gives us kind of like a jQuery-like language to talk to an SVG element. So D3 is like kind of this like nice, cool, raw rendering engine to do data visualizations and interactive charts and all of this stuff. And then C3 kind of packages up variations of this. And the use case that I had here was actually an argument I was having with my internet service provider. My internet service provider kept telling me my modem was broken, and I kind of kept telling them, no, your bandwidth is broken. And they're like, well, we're going to send an engineer over anyway to look at your modem. And so before they sent the engineer over, what I did is I started performance testing my internet, and I set up a Python script to do a speed test run, and I set that up to be twice every hour. So we did twice every hour, and I did that for a couple of weeks. And the goal was to kind of see when the speed was fast and when the speed was slow. And then I took that data and I converted it over to a custom object. And then with the custom object, you can see what I have here. So I've set up my remote objects, my remote object model, going to my custom object, custom fields, defining all of that, giving myself the JavaScript shorthand of data. And then if we look here, we see that I do an new S object model of data. So this is the JavaScript library being rendered for me. And this is the portion that I defined within that Visualforce tag itself. And so now I have that defined. I can use that to go ahead and start retrieving my records. No Apex required, no Apex form. There's no controller associated with this page at all. And because there's like 900 points of data that I'm using to do this visualization, we have a standard 100 limit when we do the retrieve. That's the max we can do. And so what I'm actually doing is I'm using offset. And there's no maximum number to the offset if I'm reading the docs correctly, which allows me to really dig deep into the data well if I need to. And so if I want to go up to 900, I just keep bumping that offset up, and it's basically giving myself a pagination into my SOCL result itself. And so I'm looping through, and I'm basically doing this retrieve over and over again. And I won't go into too much detail about the visualization itself. We could probably do a whole other webinar on data visualization within Visualforce. You can basically see that, like I was saying, it's a very jQuery-like structure. This is basically clearing everything out and then appending curves and angles and labels and things like that to create the visualization itself. So let's go ahead and look at this in action. And what I've actually done is I actually set up some dummy data to kind of show the state it was supposed to be. So I'm paying for 10 megabytes down, right? And I'm going to pull up the JavaScript console here so you can see these little blocks. Every time we do this block, we're using remote objects to go up, grab data from the data layer, and then re-render the visualization. And you can see the visualization, as it's getting more and more data, is showing the real state of my internet, right? And so once we're done loading, I think that's the last block. That's the last block. We can go over here. We can see, well, there's probably nothing wrong with my modem because at 4 a.m., when I'm sleeping, my modem is working just fine. I'm getting the 10 megabytes down that I'm supposed to be getting. And then when I'm working, and I actually work from home, and so there's not a lot of people around me using the internet at that time, I don't really see much degradation there. But then when everybody starts coming home and they start using Netflix and Hulu Plus and Amazon Video and start playing Call of Duty and Destiny or whatever, and everybody gets on the internet, we basically run into the neighborhood broad bandwidth issue that is just kind of inherent within cable when your cable provider is not giving you enough bandwidth to cover your entire neighborhood. And so the engineer from my internet service provider swung by, and he came to my house, and he's like, I'm here to look at your modem. And I'm like, before you look at my modem, you should look at something else. And so I showed him this chart, and he's like, okay, I'll go talk to my manager. And he walked away. And so data visualization for the power of consumer satisfaction, you can prove your case very easily if you can get a lot of data, and then if you use Visualforce to produce that data in a meaningful way for the good engineer. So this is a very straightforward example of just getting data and rendering this chart. What I'm going to do now is I am going to hand things over to Varun, and Varun is going to show us a more complete, a little bit more back and forth of actual data manipulation itself using Angular.js. So give me 1 second where we're going to flip control over to Varun. and sure you can hear him well.
Thanks, Josh. So that was a great intro to how you can use JavaScript in different ways on Visualforce pages. And remote objects, like Josh mentioned, is kind of very close to my heart because I was the developer who mostly worked on it. So one idea we always had in mind when we were doing remote objects was to make sure this blends well with third-party JavaScripts and also other JavaScript that we provide on the platform. So I thought it'd be a good demo to do remote objects with AngularJS, which is a Google JavaScript library that allows you to do one-page JavaScript apps, kind of enhances your HTML with its own tags, and there are providers, and you can really do some rich JavaScript applications with AngularJS. And then there is Streaming API, which is another feature of the Salesforce platform that allows you to register for notifications when your backend data changes in Salesforce. So what I came up with is this open opportunities dashboard, which is a real-time dashboard view of all the open opportunities in your org. So a sales manager or a sales rep can go in there, take a look at all the opportunities in your org, or even just hit new opportunity right there and say create an opportunity, which instantly shows up on the dashboard. There you go, and the opportunity pops right back into the grid on the top. So let's flip back to the code a little bit and see how this all works together. So if you're seeing my code right here, again, we have the very familiar Apex page where I've turned off the header, I've turned off the style sheets, the body tag, because again, I'm right now just using Visualforce as my container and trying to do all the fancy AngularJS stuff in there. So coming back to my body tag, you see the familiar AngularJS app and controller defined here. So I'm basically binding a very simple grid item to my AngularJS controller in order to render different opportunities in here. And if you go further down, I have my form where I'm trying to add the new opportunity. And all of these are just bound to methods in my AngularJS, which we'll look at in a moment. And the real trick here is to also define your Apex remote objects to basically, like Josh was mentioning, give you that proxy for your Salesforce objects inside of your JavaScript. And then I have a bunch of different static resources in here. And I also have binding for my streaming API, which I'll come back to in a moment. The real trick here is, though, in my JavaScript, let me open that up for you. So if I go into my JavaScript, this is a very basic AngularJS app where I'm defining an Angular module and I have my controller. And if you see, go through my comments here, I'm basically initting my controller and I'm creating an instance of my remote object. And then I have a bunch of bound methods, so I can update opportunities, I can add an opportunity, which essentially call out to my CRUD methods in the remote object. And one neat trick I wanted to show you guys, which is coming out with GA in remote objects, is the ability to not do just CRUD operations, but also do a describe call on an object to get the metadata. So if I go back to my form right here in the page, there is this drop down where I have a pick list of my opportunity stages. And the way I generate this is I dynamically build it with the metadata I get from the object using my describe call. So that kind of allows me to build dynamic forms and even take advantage of all the labels and all the metadata that you've put into your Salesforce organization. So one last thing I wanted to show you is, so this is good. It blends really well with AngularJS, but what really is Streaming API doing for me here? So I'm going to open up another tab for you, where we can see two dashboards at the same time. So imagine this is an opportunities dashboard, and my organization has tons of Salesforce sales representatives, and I want everybody to get a real-time view of my open opportunities. So I go in here, add a new opportunity, and if you notice, the opportunity pops right back into both of my dashboards, and it actually surprisingly came out on the second dashboard even before the first one. So that is the power of the streaming API working together with remote objects on a Visualforce page to give you a real-time view of your open opportunities. Now, again, I know there are a lot of seasoned Angular JS developers out there who are probably screaming, "Hey, we want a module, a service for remote objects. Well, where are promises and stuff?" So the idea here is always to provide you with tools on the platform, so the community out there can take the tools and come out with new things on their own. So I would really urge everyone to take a look at this uh, other library out there that was developed by Florian. And it basically gives you an Angular service, which is a wrapper around JavaScript remote objects in Visualforce. It allows you to do things like define an account service, for example, which again has all the CRUD methods in there. Again, lastly, before I give it back to Josh, I mean, the idea on the platform is to give you with tools, and we are always waiting for your feedback. So feel free to post on the communities or even in the questions right here if you have any questions, or you want us to come up with fancy more new features on remote objects or anything else in general. Back to you, Josh.
Excellent. Thank you, Varun. And also, while we're still looking at your screen here, I also want to call out that you're using yet another framework for this demonstration. You're using a visualization tool called Isotope, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So to kind of bring us all the way full circle, like with Visualforce these days, we can take it and we can make it do what we want. We can mix and match these different kinds of. Second, let me make sure there. We go. Show screen. Sorry, guys, we're flipping control a little bit here. We can mix and match these kind of frameworks together in a very meaningful way to create powerful interactions, powerful HTML5, powerful JavaScript applications using Visualforce itself. And I do also, so I was talking about before, like JavaScript remoting remote objects. One of the key things about them is that we don't have to use the API scope, but the streaming API that you're demonstrating there has no analog, right, in JavaScript remoting a remote object. So that's another great example. We can remove as much of the API scope that we don't need, but then we are doing something like a real-time communication with the streaming API. We bring that in, we use the jQuery plugin in order to communicate it out. So Visualforce has become this great engine for being very flexible with what you want to do with JavaScript. And for me, as a developer, like the anecdote that reminds me how far. So Varun, I think we were talking about this yesterday. Visualforce is in like its 27th iteration, something like that, somewhere in that neighborhood. So Visualforce has evolved quite a bit. And back in like iteration 1 years ago, there was actually a bug in Visualforce that if you were trying to use within your JavaScript greater than or less than symbol, and you didn't space it out correctly, Visualforce thought you were doing a server-side component and would actually put an error in the middle of your JavaScript saying, I don't know what server-side component you're talking about. So we've gone so far from those days where Visualforce will just sort of muddle with what you're trying to do all over the place. Now, gets out of your way, gives you the flexibility you need, and with features like JavaScript remoting, and remote objects just went GA this winter release, so it is available on your developer editions right now. You can play around with it just as soon as you pop off this webinar. You have all this great flexibility, not just from the client side, but now we're also talking about the server side as well. Also manipulating the data layer directly using our JavaScript libraries itself. And as Varun was saying, the Angular demo he's showing there, that's not an accidental. It's not like we put remote objects out there and was like, hey, let's look and see if it works with Angular. Working with Angular, working with jQuery, working with CanJS, working with D3, working with these JavaScript frameworks was a primary design goal of remote objects from day one, back in those days when we're throwing emails around with each other. And also, Varun, I have warned both you and Chris Wall that if anybody ever walks up to you and offers you a beer, is because I basically told everybody at Dreamforce who was a Visualforce developer that they kind of owe the Visualforce team a beer for remote objects itself. It is my favorite feature I think that we've put on the Force.com platform today. So let me go ahead and wrap some stuff up, and then we have some time. We're going to take a few of your questions. First thing everybody usually asks is if they can get the code, and you can get the code. I have all the demos that I had on my developer edition wrapped up into one GitHub repo. So if you go to github.com/joshburke/vfwebinar, you will be able to pick it up there. And then Varun has specifically the Angular Isotope streaming API demonstration that he was doing on his GitHub repo, which is Unvar. Saying we always use our name, but no, not on your GitHub repo.
It is kind of my name. I tried to put the code into it where I wanted to say var, but then Varun is my name, so I kind of flipped it over and I came up with Unvar.
It's like a string, gotcha, like a string wrangling of it. Gotcha, excellent. So he has that up on his at Unvar/remote objects ops. And then the frameworks, I don't really have enough room here. There's a ton of links here. We have the static resources and all that. So if you bring down our repos, you can actually just sort of start playing around with the stuff right away. But the frameworks we were using for the demos, just to call them all out for you: jQuery, Reveal.js, C3.js, D3.js, Angular.js, Isotope, and ng remote. So that was a decent number of frameworks that we were trying to display for you, within about 50-minute period. Now, if you're going to go on and learn more about the Salesforce platform, I'm very excited to announce we have released this at Dreamforce. And I'm very excited to announce that it is available on developer.salesforce.com. This is a project very near and dear to my heart. I've been associated with it since its very beginning, and I offer a huge, also a free beer and big thanks to the great developers at developer.salesforce.com itself for getting this up and production worthy and out to the public. Trailhead is an interactive learning experience. It is associated with your Salesforce developer profile, and what you can do is you can go through trails of content, and the trails of content will teach you aspects of the platform. And when you get through part of a trail, you can take an interactive challenge, and the interactive challenge goes against your developer edition. And when you pass a challenge, you get points, and if you pass an entire path, you get a badge. And everybody loves points and badges. So you learn things, you get points, you get badges, and all of those points and badges are associated back to your Salesforce developer profile. There is a minimal amount of content for Visualforce at the moment, but we are in the throes right now of getting more production-worthy content up on Trailhead. That will be happening in the next few months, early into next year, and Visualforce is actually one of the first things that we are going to be adding more content into Trailhead. Now, we also have two online experiences for you. One is Udacity, which is kind of intended for new app builders, and it's a video course that allows you to go through and learn specific aspects of the platform. And then we also have over from another colleague of mine, Christoph Conrad's, up on GitHub. He has a whole workshop online, which is basically a start to scratch, building a whole application, which is sort of end to end from the custom data model all the way to using Apex and Visualforce and the API. So if you have people, most of the people here are probably existing Visualforce developers, but if you know people in the office, for instance, who are wanting to learn the platform, here are some great tutorials and resources for you.